Good morning to everyone. As was said in the first service, glad to see all of you who were able to successfully manage your clocks this morning for our Bible class. It is nice and the sunshine is coming through the doors this morning as we meet for this study of the book of Genesis and its implications throughout for our theology as we study through the New Testament and how Genesis impacts that. Today we're going to finish up the second half of Hebrews, and the Hebrews writer had a lot to use Genesis for. We looked at last week. We looked at the role of Melchizedek. We looked at and the typology of Christ, how he fulfilled the role, how he set the role of a priest king, the king of peace, the king of righteousness, and how that plays into how the Hebrews writer set up that idea for him, and set us up for the typology of how we can view Christ in that same role. As we look at this, we're going to be picking up in Hebrews chapter 11. If you want to be turning there, we're going to be spending most of our time in there. There's a little bit in chapter 12 that we're also going to look at. But Hebrews chapter 11, it's always brought about a little bit of interest because of both its literary form and all the theological content that are there in this one chapter. We typically know this as the faith chapter. It gives a definition of faith right off the top, and then it goes through a list of the history of the entire Old Testament. Specifically focus on a lot of the stories from Genesis and a little bit more within that, but it focuses on how those characters displayed faith, and it looks towards the idea of I forgot to pick that up. It looks towards the idea of how do we view our own faith, and how can we look toward, and how the characters in first century church, how were they impacted? What did they need faith in? Their faith was in the future, it was in the future promises of God, just as ours is today. But they were under persecution, and they were under persecution so much that they were thinking of going back to Judaism. That is this Jesus really worth it for the amount of persecution that we are suffering in this time frame? And the author of Hebrews says yes, he is so worth it, that he is worth it from what you have come from, and he is worth it towards what you are going to because of Jesus, because Jesus is better than, and he makes the argument, that's his argument over and over again. Jesus is better than what you came from, and Jesus is because he is better than, then you have a hope of something future. And the second half of the book deals with that. What are you heading towards? And why is he better than in your present day? He was better in the past, he's better now. And that applies to our lives today also. We make a choice as Christians today. We chose to leave the world. Whatever situation you came from, he's better than what you came from by living in this. And because he's better than, you have the opportunities in the church, but not only in the church, in the future to come. And not just heaven. We look towards heaven a lot, but as we go through our life, how is he better than? And we look at that as we look through this chapter on faith. There's lots of examples is in the Old Testament and and a couple others in the New Testament that give a recounting of the history of Israel. You see ones like in Nehemiah chapter 9. There's 5 of them in the Psalms: Psalm 78, 105, 106, 135, and 136. And then Ezekiel 20. All of those are examples where they recount the history of Israel in a short narrative. But you also see that in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen is telling this the history of Israel, and we looked at that as we take a look at how they impact that. But these retellings of the biblical narrative, they differ in the purpose for their audience. This one we already talked about is a history of is it better than? And they select the characters that are necessary to give that story, because the Bible, even the same character, has lots of different lessons within that same story. It includes different events that would go towards that. And as we look at this today, for example, when we look at the story of Jacob, he looks at one specific instance of that, and why did he choose that one specific story? He leaves out a lot of others that that were great stories of faith. But then he also mentions some that are unexpected, like he brings in Rahab as a part of that story that's usually not included in the stories of the history of Israel. But then he leaves out the kings almost entirely, other than a slight mention of David at the very end. So kings like Josiah that brought the Israelites back were left out in this story. So it's as though he's telling the story and being selective with what can be brought into this. And he comes along at the very end of this and says, I don't have time to tell you all that. And that's kind of a preacher trick. I don't have time to tell you about this. I don't have time. And it'll bring up those extra points just so that they can bring those in. He had all the time that he needed to bring those into play. But he's mentioning them to bring them back to their memory as he's going through this. The author here is unknown in Hebrew, so we'll just keep referring to him as the author. It's one of the only unsigned that scholars debate on, but we believe it's some type of sermon that was being given and was written down for us today, that he was giving to the early church. And distributed as a way to talk to the entire Jewish audience. These texts from Genesis are reproduced by extended allusion. There's very few direct quotes from it in this passage. But we're going to take actually a step back to see this through a slightly different lens. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, this is one of the key verses in Romans. In Romans 1:17, it says, "The righteous shall live by faith." And that's a quote from Habakkuk chapter 2 also. But in the writer of Hebrews, he also quotes this in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Habakkuk chapter 2 says, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith." And that's one of the key verses to view chapter 11 through. He quotes this in 10:36 through 38 and says, "For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But the righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." He gives this as a a paraphrase of Habakkuk, depending on the translation that you're reading from. Sometimes the authors from the New Testament, they had access to the Greek New Testament. Sometimes they had access to the Hebrew version of the New Testament. And so these things may shift around a little bit. But as you read through them, the basic idea is there from Habakkuk chapter 2. He's saying that the righteous will live by faith. That one phrase there at the end. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and he needs to wait. That idea, the idea of patience and the idea of the righteous will live by faith. So he makes the connection back and forth between it. So if the righteous are going to live by faith, then those who do have faith are righteous. He makes that inference that goes back and forth between that. So if you have faith, then he takes the phrase from Genesis that says that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. So if his faith is what made him righteous, then it does the same thing for us today. By us hoping and waiting and being patient, then we have the ability to continue to grow, and we can as we grow, we can wait patiently for God in the faith that he has set before us. So we look at this story. We look at these set of stories in Hebrews chapter 11. And how does this model for us the type of life that we should live? Specifically through that lens of Genesis. Because if you don't know this, he doesn't give enough story here for somebody that isn't familiar with those stories to really get their hooks into it. But he gives enough to kind of point you from what you already know as a student of the Word, and that you've read through Genesis and are familiar with those stories, that he gives enough of a reference to show here's what that story meant in the context of faith. So he begins off Hebrews chapter 11. As we read through that, he talks about creation, that nothing was made through that. So his idea of the Word of God being so powerful that it was able to create. He starts off Hebrews chapter 11 with that. And then he goes into Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. His first character that he actually mentions as being faithful is going to be Abel. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 10 is what he is alluding to, the story of Cain and Abel, and specifically mentioning that Abel is going to be one of those key figures of faith. Now, he has to make that connection across, because it never actually talks about Abel's faith. It doesn't talk about that word faith in Genesis chapter 4. It talks about him being pleasing to God, and that let's read the text, and then we'll come back to that in just a moment. In Genesis chapter 4, beginning in verse 2, it says, "And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborns of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offerings." This passage focuses on the faithful obedience from the Old Testament to show that God's favor was on those whose trust led to obedience. Abel was the second son of Adam and Eve after his older brother Cain, according to Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Both brought sacrifices to God, but Abel's was apparently a more sincere and an acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Despite God's reassurances, Cain responded to God's rejection of his sacrifice by murdering his brother and attempting to hide the body. This makes Abel an interesting inclusion on this list of faith. The pattern being shown here is that God will bless those who respond to him in obedience. Yet the opening example is the is the victim of Scripture's first recorded murder. However, this fits perfectly with the purpose of the book of Hebrews. Faith, as defined earlier, is a forward-looking trust, the evidence of things not seen, the hope of what's to come. It's that God will make good on his promises, even when that fulfillment is unseen to us. Abel obeyed God's commands in faith, and he was accepted by God because of it. It wasn't the ritual actions of sacrifice that we was doing. It was this, and his sacrifice wasn't a cleansing from sin. That wasn't set up until we come into the Mosaic law, the cleansing of sin. This was a sacrifice that was a thank offering to God. It was giving praise to God. It was their form of worship. And it was that faith in God is what saved him. There's no discussion here in Hebrews of what gifts were offered or why Abel's sacrifice would have been considered more acceptable than Cain's, although he closely follows the structure and the wording of the scriptural source. His selective omissions and emphasis results in a greater focus on the person of Abel when compared to the Genesis account. When you look at Genesis chapter 4, it's mostly about Cain and then the effect of what he did. Hebrews 11 talks more about Abel. It actually omits Cain in overall. A similar result was noted last week in the retelling of the Melchizedek passage. Abel is declared to be righteous, a word not present in Genesis chapter 4. But it's transferred from the Habakkuk citation to him as a reasonable inference, assuming that God looks with favor upon the offerings of the righteous. Despite suffering a violent end to his earthly life, God worked out everything for Abel's good in an eternal sense. Abel was accepted by God, while his murderer was not. And Abel's example of faith is still a potent lesson, despite the fact that he was killed for his faith. Genesis chapter 5, verse 24, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5. In Genesis chapter 5, we see the story of Enoch. That Enoch, let's read these 4 verses as we look through this story. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God, and after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's all it says about him in the Old Testament. He was for this day and time, 365 years was a short lifespan. Most of them were living closer to 800 and 900 years at this point in time. So he died a young man at 365. But he didn't die. Enoch was one of 2 characters in the Bible that we see that didn't die, that they were just, that God took them. It doesn't say, when we see this in the life of Elijah, we know he went up in a fiery chariot. Enoch, we know he was no more. And this is confirmed in the book of Jude, which we'll look at a little bit next week. But the story of Enoch here is one not of his death or lack thereof, but it's the story of his life. Because in verse 24, it talks about that he walked with God. It's this drastic contrast. So far, we can tell from his appearance in the book of Genesis, he did not experience that physical death. He was taken by God. While Abel suffered, and this is an interesting contrast between the first character that we just looked at. Abel suffered the worst possible end to his earthly experience, being violently murdered by his own flesh and blood. Versus Enoch, he never had to die at all. The example given by Enoch is that he so walked with God that he was taken before death. Crucially, the writer of Hebrews points out that it was Enoch's faith that motivated his behavior. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Taking that verse 6, a lot of times we take that verse 6 out of context. We use that one verse to show that faith is necessary to please God. But when you look at this in the context of the storyline that he's trying to tell, he talks about Enoch, and then he brings up that faith is necessary to please God. And he's trying to make that connection across. He's trying to make the connection across that Enoch was one who pleased God. He walked with God. He was, and because of that, he had faith. He's demonstrating that inverse relationship that is necessary to please God, that faith is necessary to please God. And since Enoch walked with him, he must have had faith. And these are the promises that come as a result of having faith. Genesis does not say specifically that he had faith, but it does say that he pleased God. And when we translate that back through Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, but the righteous shall live by his faith. So it can be inferred that those with whom God is pleased do have faith. The contrast between Abel and Enoch is important. Both are recipients of God's acceptance. Early history, but both were part of the acceptance of God, even though their lives came to much different ends. The theme of this part of Hebrews is that faith looks forward, despite incomplete knowledge. Though we cannot see all ends here and now, God is moving towards an eventual fulfillment of all promises. What happens during our earthly lives is only a part of that success. What happens now is not the end. As a result, believers are not guaranteed success in the mortal world, as a prosperity gospel would say. It's about looking towards the future. It's not about looking towards our current circumstances and what we see within that. The next section that we're going to look, the next character that he brings up is the character of Noah. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, it says, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes in faith, or by faith. This passage is a little bit longer, so he summarizes it in just this one verse. He gives this, the third exemplar, Noah, here is presented through an elusive summary of the building of the ark. Genesis chapter 6, verse 9 provides the key to the author's interpretation of this passage as it reads, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That's that same statement that was talked about with Enoch, that he walked with God. And it's saying that Noah was also in that same vein, that he was one that walked with God. And that because he walked with God, his righteousness was present. And because of his righteousness, you can now make that connection across. We know more about the story of Noah. Noah, listed here, exemplifies that trusting obedience. God's communication with Noah was relatively detailed, especially what we know of that communication. We know that Enoch, we know that Adam, we know all of them talked with God, and they walked with God, and it talks about Adam walked with him in the cool of the day. But we know here the specific verbiage of God as he gives them instructions to build the ark. He was told about the coming flood more than 100 years in advance, and how the ark would serve to rescue mankind. All Noah had to do was obey, which he did. Genesis chapter 6, verse 22. Of course, Noah would have grappled with his own unanswered questions, which is what the writer means by referring to as events as yet unseen. God gives us things today that we don't understand why that we do those things. He gives us things. He gives us things as a part of our worship service that we don't yet understand. He asks us to trust him that this is the way that it should be. He asks us to live our lives in a way that seems contrary to what we feel is best, especially those of the world. Those of the world will say, "Oh, I don't feel that that's right. That just doesn't seem right to me." But did it seem right to Noah to build a boat in the middle of the desert or in the middle of a garden? It's probably filled with lots of trees and other things to be able to make this large structure over the course of that 100 years. And over the course of 100 years, he had to continually work in his faith. He had to have that trusting obedience that was necessary to be able to build something that he didn't yet know existed. They didn't even know that rain didn't even exist at this time. And yet there was going to be a flood where it rained for so long that it would flood the entire earth. And everybody who wasn't in the ark, that didn't trust God, was not going to receive that salvation from God. It talks about that he preached to those around him. He tried to save his friends. He tried to save those that were around him, but those didn't trust in God. And because they did not trust in God, then they did not receive the salvation that came through the ark. Noah's trust proved the wickedness of those who rejected God, and his obedience and his confidence in God saved his family. Noah is referred to here as the heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Obedience to God in the book of Hebrews is often tied to the concept of an inheritance, that we inherit the faith that comes through this, and because of that, we choose to obey. It also refers to those victorious rewards that God intends us to obtain by following his will. How the inheritance from Abraham applies to us even today. God intends us to obtain this by following his will, by trusting in him, and Noah is one of those exemplar characters. It's contrasted with the actions of the nation of Israel, as described earlier in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 3, it talks about how the Israelites were falling away. They were choosing not to obey God by choosing to reject his son, Jesus. And because of that, their history of choosing over and over again to reject the will of God, Noah was that example of, you can trust in God. Here's a guy who did it. You can do it too. He gives another example in Abraham. Abraham appears to be there was several different key verses within this. It was significant character for it was. He talks about Abraham over and over again, just like many of the New Testament authors do. We had that earlier discussion last week in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 7 and chapter 7, where over and over again Abraham was referred to for different key points. But now he's going to specifically highlight his faith. He's subject to a lengthy treatment in this central section of the historical review. Hebrews focuses on three key moments in Abraham's life. It's not a synopsis of all the chapters that refer to him in Genesis. We don't hear about his battle with the five kings. We don't hear about how he chose the land with Lot. We don't hear all those stories. We hear specific things that the author wants us to know that say, here's how Abraham really demonstrated faith. Here was the stories that point us towards that. The first one is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, that he highlights in Hebrews 11, 8, and 9. The Hebrews account of Abraham's call to leave his home. He left Haran. His dad had already left Ur to go up to Haran, and then but his dad stayed there. His dad stayed in Haran. That's the northern part of the fertile Crescent Valley. God said, that wasn't where I wanted you to be. You did leave. You did leave where you were, but that wasn't where I needed you to be. I needed you to take inheritance, take possession of the land in Canaan. He says that it includes two words that were taken directly from Scripture. From the text in Genesis. The word go out, it appears twice in this passage from Hebrews, and the word tents, that they lived in tents in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. The author pushes towards the wider narrative of Abraham's journey to Canaan and enables the author to draw out the interpretation that Abraham was not settled in the promised land, but he was looking forward to a better homeland. This is the greater than. The homeland that is promised for us is an allegory to what Abraham was looking forward to, that there was something better that he was looking for. To this point in chapter 11, the writer has defined faith from the perspective of forward-looking trust in God's promises. This is in the context of taking all we know of God, the evidence of Scripture, the history, and our experiences, and using it to hold fast to our confidence that God will make good on His word. That confidence naturally should lead us to obey Him, even when we can't see the end of the story. This is the core property of a saving faith, a trust that God will be God. One of the Bible's greatest examples of this kind of trusting faith is Abraham. Here, the writer specifically mentions the moment when Abraham, the named Abram, was called by God to leave his homeland. Though Abraham didn't know exactly what the future will hold, he chose to obey God and to leave behind the gods of his forefathers and follow after this God that he walked with. This particular section of Hebrews focuses on the general pattern of faith and how God responds by blessing those who obey. The verse also mentions Abraham's son and grandson, Isaac and Jacob. God gave to them the same promises given to Abraham. This is a key point that many readers might miss. God's promise to Abraham was to create a large and mighty nation, occupying a particular territory. That promise was not entirely fulfilled in the lifetime of Abraham, nor was it completed during the life of Isaac or Jacob. However, their faith in God led them to obey and to trust, knowing that God was able to make good on His promises. Those of us reading their stories today can look back and see how God did, in fact, fulfill His guarantees, just as the people in Joshua did. In Joshua chapter 1, he gives that story of how our forefathers were told we would take possession of the land. We're here now to do it. That should inspire us to be all the more confident in our faith. The next time in Abraham's life is the birth of Isaac. Hebrews links the birth of Isaac to the theme of faith, and rather unusually refers to the role of Sarah in this conception. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, the Bible reads, "By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Despite being barren for some 90 years, Sarah was able to conceive and give birth to a son, just as God had promised. We see, though, that Sarah at one point in time had tried to help out God by using her servant Hagar as a servant mother. The attribution of faith to Sarah also seems problematic, since the Genesis narrative states that she laughed at the idea that she would bear a child in her own age. Even the name of that promised child, Isaac, means laughter, was a reference to the reaction of both Abraham and Sarah to God's initial promise of a natural-born child. They laughed. But given that the figure of Abraham is at the center of this section of chapter 11, many commentators take the verse to mean that he, together with Sarah, received the power to conceive. This lesson, it seems, is that even when you have doubts, and we will have doubts, that doesn't mean that you don't have faith, that you can't grow into the faith. Sarah, as an example here, is a demonstration that even when we try and sometimes help out God, that doesn't work. But when we learn to trust him, when we actually believe that he can fulfill those promises, and believe that he is able, then we know that this can be fulfilled. The Hebrew writer is commending faith, specifically a trusting reliance on God. He brings examples that are just as flawed as we are. Later, as the theme shifts to faith in the face of more dire circumstances, we will see that true faith does not make a person morally or spiritually perfect. Sarah was introduced here to help us to understand that even when we doubt, we can grow into faith. Genesis chapter 21 and 22, the offering of Isaac, or the almost offering of Isaac for sacrifice, is the next example in Abraham's life. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. The text highlights the significance of Isaac as the only son of Sarah and Abraham, and the one through whom the promises were to be fulfilled. When God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the one through whom all of his promises were meant to be fulfilled, Abraham could not see how God would keep his word. And yet, Abraham obeyed. The ultimate example of this faith is, do we trust? In Abraham is, do we trust even when we don't see how that's going to be fulfilled? If God commands us to do this, do we see how even if we can't see how it's going to be fulfilled, the things yet unseen, as the Hebrew author says, do we trust that we're going to continue to go towards that path that God has set for us? That trust was established through a decades-long trust. It wasn't just a one time that Abraham trusted in God. This was over decades that he developed the trust. We don't develop faith in moments. You don't come up out of the waters of baptism and automatically have faith that can move mountains. They have the eagerness to move mountains a lot of times when you come up out of baptism, because you realize what God has done for you. But real, true, and lasting faith comes from trusting God in the everyday. It comes from decades of trusting him over and over and over again, to where you believe that he can move those mountains, that he can, as it says here, Abraham believed that whatever God was going to do in this situation. If he needed to, he was going to raise Isaac back from the dead. And that would have solved the problem of Isaac fulfilling the destiny that it was, that God had promised to him through Isaac. Because he had specifically named that this was the child. But you're telling me specifically to do this, so I'm going to make sure that I get this done. The next offering that we see here is three quick references. There's one to Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau. It's a very truncated one. In verse 20, it says, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. This is the first of a series of three brief statements about Israel's patriarchs, but it's specifically on the blessings that are to come to them. It wasn't about all the times that Isaac demonstrated faith otherwise. It's about the blessings that are to come to you in the future. And that you were given these, that he gave future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Then he talks about, in the next passage, by faith, in verse 21, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of the staff. Those were actually two separate instances that he's referring to. He gave one set of blessings to all his sons, and then he gave another set of blessings to Manasseh and Ephraim, where he laid his hands on his heads and he switched their hands. And he switched his hands and gave the blessing to the younger. But it was still about the blessing of what's to come. We have to look towards the future. Are we looking towards the future and what we have? Then the last one is in verse 22, by faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Despite being over 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, the thing he focuses on is the very end in Genesis chapter 50, where he says he wants his bones to be buried back in Canaan. That he wants to go back to that land. He's looking forward to the future. Now, it was over 400 years before that was done. But he knew that this was where they were supposed to be. And he looks forward to the future of what was to happen. That ends up where he looks at Genesis in this passage of faith. But he does one more time in Hebrews chapter 12. He holds out a specific negative example. He didn't mention this with Esau. He said Esau received a blessing. Esau didn't receive the blessing that he thought he would. This is giving them a warning. He gives them a blessing, but it's not the one that he thinks he should have gotten. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 16 and 17, he says that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. These two narratives are being put together, the blessing and the birthright. But he sold it. He sold his birthright for a bowl of stew, and it says in Genesis, it talks about that Esau despised his birthright, but not in the second one where he was tricked by Jacob and he's tricked by Jacob and Rebekah. We're not to fall to temptation, because he's telling them here that you need to be careful. That while there are all these great examples in Genesis, there's also some negative things in your storyline. Don't be like Esau. Don't reject your birthright that was given to you. That inheritance that we talked about in chapter 11, he says in chapter 12, don't reject it. Don't be like Esau and willing to sell your birthright for just a single bowl of stew. Don't be careless. Don't be lazy. Don't be defiant when it comes to your faith. Those are some words that he kept using throughout the rest of the book of Hebrews, telling them to continue to hold on until you get to the end. There's one last time in Hebrews 12:24 that says, but you have come to the, in verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. It's not the blood of Abel. It's not the sacrifice of this world that saves us. He's saying Jesus is the final offering. It's not the offering of sacrifices that saves